He lost his father in the war and thought his life was ruined. But it was his dog who pointed to a photo every day that held a secret. When the boy learned the truth, everything changed. See what really happened. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day the letter arrived was the day the house of the Clarks grew colder than the winter wind outside. A uniformed officer had knocked on the door with a sealed envelope in his hand, his face carved from stone, his voice heavy with the weight of practiced condolences. Inside the envelope were the words no family wished to read. Sergeant Daniel Clark, husband, father, protector, had been declared killed in action during an overseas mission. The report was brief, official, devoid of warmth. It told them nothing of the last seconds of his life, nothing of the place where he fell, nothing of the truth. It simply closed a chapter with a stamp and a signature, leaving those who loved him to drown in silence. Elliot was only 10 years old, and yet that morning he aged by decades. His small hands shook as he clutched the arm of his mother, who sank into a chair as though the weight of the world had finally broken her. She stared at the words on the paper but could not read them. Her eyes filled with tears too thick to let meaning pass. For Elliot, the world shifted into something unfamiliar. The walls of the house that once seemed safe now loomed over him. The ticking of the clock on the wall was too loud, too cruel, as if counting the seconds of a life without his father. He tried to imagine a tomorrow where Daniel would not come home, where his laugh would no longer echo through the rooms, where his strong arms would never lift him high into the air again. The thought suffocated him. The neighbors came with their quiet words, the pastor with his prayers, but none of it filled the emptiness. Elliot sat in his room at night, the covers pulled tightly around him, staring at the dark ceiling, feeling as though something had been stolen not just from his family, but from the very air he breathed. His father had been more than a soldier in uniform. He had been the anchor of Elliot's world. Without him, everything drifted. School became impossible. Friends stopped calling. Teachers looked at him with pity but could not reach him. His nights were haunted by dreams of gunfire and faceless men pulling his father away. He woke with a scream more often than not, his small chest heaving, his throat raw, his heart broken anew each dawn. Even the family dog, Ray, seemed to mourn. Ray had grown alongside Elliot, a large shepherd with a loyalty so fierce it felt human. Daniel had trained him, played with him, trusted him. To the boy, Ray was more than a pet. He was a guardian, a living memory of his father's love. But after the letter, Ray changed. He no longer bounded across the yard with his ball or wagged his tail when dinner was served. Instead, he lay stretched before the front door for hours, ears pricked, as if waiting for the sound of boots that would never return. His eyes, once bright and playful, now mirrored the grief of the family. Yet grief did not end with silence. Soon came the strangeness, the nightly ritual that first seemed coincidence, and then grew into mystery. In the living room, on a wooden shelf, stood a framed photograph of Daniel in uniform. His shoulders were squared, his gaze proud, his lips curved in the faintest smile that hinted at both duty and warmth. It was Elliot's favorite picture, the one he would glance at when the pain was too much. It was also the one Ray seemed obsessed with. Every night, without fail, Ray would pad across the floor, sit before the shelf, and stare at the photograph. He would stare for long minutes, his head tilted slightly, his ears low, a low whine trembling in his throat. Then, just as if compelled by something unseen, he would lift his paw and touch the frame. The photograph would wobble, teeter, and fall face down upon the floor. At first, Elliot thought little of it. Perhaps the shelf was uneven. Perhaps the dog brushed it accidentally while searching for his father's scent. But when it happened again and again, each night without fail, his certainty began to erode. The pattern was too perfect to be ignored. Ray did not knock over any other photograph. Not the one of the family at the beach, not the one of Elliot as a baby, not the wedding picture of his parents. Always and only the photograph of Daniel in uniform. The dog would nudge it down, then lie beside it as though guarding it. Elliot tried propping it higher, moving it slightly, even scolding the dog. But nothing changed. Night after night, the same photo, the same ritual. The boy began to feel that the house itself was trying to speak to him through Ray's strange devotion. He watched the dog with wide eyes, torn between disbelief and a desperate desire to believe in something beyond grief. His mother noticed nothing, wrapped in her own sorrow. She moved like a ghost through the days, her face pale, her words few. Elliot was alone in his observation, alone in his curiosity, and increasingly convinced that the dog was trying to tell him something. One evening, as the last light of day painted the walls in fading gold, Elliot crouched beside Ray after the photograph had once again fallen. He touched the frame gently, tracing his father's smile, and looked into the dog's dark eyes. There was something in them, something urgent, something pleading. It was then that the boy's suspicion grew into determination. He could not shake the thought that this was not mere coincidence. There was a message here, hidden in the repetition, waiting to be uncovered. That night he lay awake in bed, his mind racing. He remembered the stories his father used to tell him about codes, about signs, about how soldiers sometimes left messages in the smallest of gestures. Could Ray, in his own way, be part of such a message? Could his father have left behind something more than memory? The thought refused to leave him. His chest tightened with both fear and hope. He wanted to dismiss it as childish fantasy, but deep down, in the quietest part of his heart, he felt certain. Days passed, but the ritual continued. The sound of the frame hitting the floor became as inevitable as the setting sun. Elliot grew restless. His grief transformed into a need for action. He began to wonder if the answers he craved were hidden not in words of neighbors or in prayers of pastors, but in the behavior of a loyal dog and a falling photograph. It was on a particularly stormy night, when thunder rolled across the sky and the rain lashed the windows, that Elliot made his decision. The shadows flickered on the walls. The house creaked, and once more he heard the soft scrape of paw against wood, followed by the dull thud of the photo falling. He sat upright in his bed, his fists clenched. He would no longer sit by idly. He would discover the truth behind this pattern, no matter what it meant. With that thought burning inside him, Elliot prepared himself for the task. He would find a way to capture what was happening, to see it with his own eyes, to prove that his instincts were right. He felt a mixture of dread and determination, like a soldier stepping into unknown territory. The grief of losing his father had given way to something else, an unshakable resolve to follow the thread that fate seemed to dangle before him. And so, in the silence that followed the storm, the boy made his choice. He would set a watch over the photograph, just as his dog had done. He would not look away. He would see for himself what secrets, if any, lay behind the nightly ritual. For the first time since the letter arrived, his heart beat not only with sorrow, but with a fragile, trembling hope. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the house. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. Elliot lay awake in his bed, his small frame curled beneath the covers, his eyes wide and restless. He could not stop thinking about what he had seen so many times now, about Ray's unshakable devotion to the photograph and the inevitability with which it always fell to the floor. The thud of the frame had become an unspoken language in the household, though no one but Elliot seemed to hear it. His mother remained locked in her quiet grief, and the boy knew that if he spoke to her about his suspicion, she would dismiss it as his imagination. Yet something deep inside told him there was more to it. The next morning, when the pale light of dawn slid through the curtains, Elliot's mind was already set. He would not let another night pass without answers. He found an old phone in a drawer, cracked at the corner but still able to record, and propped it carefully on a stack of books across from the shelf where the photograph stood. He adjusted the angle, ensuring the frame was in clear view, his fingers trembling as though he were preparing for an experiment that might change everything. Ray sat beside him, watching with unblinking eyes as if aware of the boy's intentions. Elliot glanced at the dog and felt, not for the first time, that Ray understood more than any animal should. When evening fell, Elliot set the phone to record and crept into bed. His heart thudded so loudly in his chest that he feared it might wake the whole house. He pulled the blanket up to his chin and waited, listening to the creak of the house settling, the occasional sigh of wind through the branches outside, and the steady breathing of his dog lying at the foot of his bed. Sleep came slowly, heavy and uncertain, until at last he drifted into dreams haunted by the sound of falling glass and the sight of his father's face. When the morning came, Elliot woke before the sun had fully risen. His hands shook as he picked up the phone. He hesitated, terrified of what he might see. Terrified, too, that he might see nothing at all, that his fragile hope would shatter and leave him only with grief. He tapped the screen, and the recording came to life. The image was grainy in the dim light of the room, the shadows long and flickering. For a moment, nothing happened, and Elliot felt his stomach twist with dread. Then he saw movement. Ray appeared in the frame, padding softly toward the shelf. The dog sat in front of the photograph of Daniel, just as he had every night, his head tilted, his gaze locked on the image. He sat there for what seemed like hours, silent, watchful. Then slowly, deliberately, Ray lifted his paw and touched the frame. It rocked once, twice, and fell forward with a soft clatter. Elliot gasped. The proof was undeniable. This was not chance. The dog was not brushing past it carelessly, not stumbling or bumping it by accident. Ray was doing it with purpose, with intent. Elliot replayed the moment again and again, his breath shallow, his skin prickling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Something about the way the dog stared before knocking the photo, something about the quiet urgency in his eyes convinced the boy beyond doubt. There was a reason. There had to be a reason. He leapt from his bed and hurried to the living room, his bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The photograph lay face down where it had fallen the night before. His hands trembled as he picked it up, turning it over, staring at his father's frozen smile. He pressed his thumb against the glass, as though by some miracle it might grow warm again. Then as he adjusted the frame, he felt it, something uneven at the back. His breath caught. The wooden panel was thicker than it should have been, the edge slightly raised. He slid his finger along it and felt the corner of tape. With trembling hands, he pried it open. There, hidden against the backing, was a small black USB stick. It was taped securely, almost invisible unless one looked with intent. Elliot froze, his eyes wide, his mouth dry. His heart pounded so loudly he thought his mother might hear it from the next room. He held the device between his fingers, staring at it as if it might vanish into thin air. The world seemed to tilt around him, the walls leaning closer, the floor shifting beneath his feet. Something his father had left behind. Something that had waited for him all this time. Elliot staggered backward, clutching the USB stick to his chest. Questions crashed through his mind like a wave. How had it gotten there? When had his father left it? What could possibly be on it? His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped it. Ray whined softly, his tail brushing against the floor, his eyes fixed on the boy, as if urging him onward. Elliot swallowed hard and hurried to the desk where the family laptop sat. He fumbled with the keys, pulling the machine from its slumber, the familiar hum of its fan filling the quiet room. He slid the USB into the port. For a moment, nothing happened, and panic clawed at his chest. Then slowly, a folder appeared on the screen. Inside was a single file. Just one. Elliot's throat tightened. The file was a video, its name nothing more than a date, written in plain numbers. His finger hovered over the trackpad, his entire body tense, every muscle taut with dread and anticipation. He clicked. The screen went black for a second, then flickered to life. Elliot leaned forward, his breath caught in his throat. And then he saw him, his father. Daniel Clark sat in a plain room, its walls bare, the light dim. He looked tired, older, but unmistakably alive. His hair was longer, his uniform gone, replaced by simple civilian clothes. He stared directly into the camera, and Elliot felt the world collapse and rebuild itself in an instant. His father was not gone. He was here, speaking, breathing, alive. Elliot's hands flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with shock and wonder. He wanted to cry, to scream, to laugh all at once. His chest ached with emotions too big for his small body. Behind him, Ray barked once, sharp and loud, as if to confirm the truth. Elliot reached for the screen, his fingertips trembling against the glass as though he might bridge the distance. The sound of his father's voice filled the room, low and steady, carrying the weight of secrets Elliot could not yet grasp. In that moment, the grief that had wrapped itself around Elliot's heart like iron began to loosen. The photograph, the nightly ritual, the hidden USB it had all been leading to this. His father had left behind more than silence. He had left a message, a truth waiting to be uncovered. And Elliot, with the help of a faithful dog, had found it. The boy sat frozen before the screen, his eyes locked on his father's image, his world shifting in ways he could not yet understand. The shadows in the house seemed less heavy now, the silence less cruel. Something had broken open, a door between despair and hope, and Elliot had stepped through it. He did not yet know what revelations awaited him in the words of the video, but he knew this much. His father had not abandoned him. He was still here, and that truth was enough to change everything. The screen glowed faintly in the dim room, casting pale light across Elliot's face. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at the moving image before him. The man who spoke on the screen was not a ghost, not a memory, not the lifeless figure described in the cold letter that had shattered his family. It was his father, Daniel Clark, alive. He looked thinner, his hair slightly unkempt, his eyes weary but burning with something deeper than exhaustion. He stared directly into the camera as if he could see through time, as if he knew his son would one day sit where Elliot now sat, trembling with disbelief and hope. Daniel's voice was steady, though there was weight in every word. He said that if Elliot was watching this, then fate had played its part, and the message had reached the one person he had most wanted it to reach. He spoke of the day that had been marked as his death, how it had not been an end, but a beginning of something hidden, something dangerous. On that mission far from home, he had uncovered truths that were never meant to surface. They were not truths about enemies in uniform, but about powerful figures who wore no visible badges, yet held control over the strings of nations. He described how what he had found was a thread in a web so vast that pulling at it endangered not just him, but everyone he loved. As Elliot listened, his chest tightened, his fingers clutching the edge of the desk. His father's words were heavy, spoken with the quiet force of someone who had seen too much. Daniel explained how once he attempted to report what he had discovered, the threats began. He was warned, cornered, silenced. Death had been promised not only to him, but to his family. It was then that others intervened. People he called a secret team, men and women who lived in shadows to protect those targeted by such power. They had taken him, hidden him, and together they had staged his death. To the world he had fallen in service. To his wife and son, he had vanished into grief. But in truth, he had been carried away into exile, unable to contact those he loved for fear that a single word might draw danger upon them. Elliot felt tears burning in his eyes as he listened. He had spent nights imagining the moment of his father's death, haunted by what he could not know. Now he was being told it had never happened, that the sacrifice had not been his father's life, but his presence, his closeness, his laughter. Daniel's voice faltered for the first time as he admitted how much it had broken him to leave, how many nights he had lain awake in silence, wondering what his son might think of him, whether he would be remembered as strong or resented as absent. He said that the hardest part of all was not facing death, but enduring the knowledge that his boy was growing without him, that every birthday, every moment, was a memory lost to a false grave. The image flickered slightly as if the recording itself carried the strain of secrecy. Daniel leaned closer to the camera, his eyes sharp, his jaw tight. He spoke directly to Elliot, not as a soldier to the world, but as a father to his child. He told him he had trusted that one day the message would be found. He had chosen the photograph carefully, knowing Ray would never abandon it. He had left the USB behind with someone he trusted, asking that it be hidden there, waiting for the only person who would notice the pattern, who would have the heart to follow the clue. He told Elliot that he had always believed his son was braver than he realized, more perceptive than anyone gave him credit for, and that belief had carried him through the darkness of separation. Elliot pressed a trembling hand to his mouth, tears spilling down his cheeks. The grief that had poisoned his days now mingled with fierce pride. His father had not forgotten him. His father had counted on him. Every tear, every night spent staring at the ceiling, every moment of despair suddenly had meaning. He had not been left behind. He had been trusted with a secret. Daniel's tone shifted, heavy again with the burden of the truth he carried. He spoke of the men he had exposed, of the corruption that spread like rot behind polished walls. He said names Elliot did not understand, described things that seemed too large for a boy of 10 to grasp. But what mattered was the intent, the danger, the sense that his father's silence had not been choice but necessity. The threats had been real, the peril closer than anyone knew. He told Elliot that even now he could not reveal everything, not in a single recording, not while enemies still hunted for him. But he promised that what he had uncovered had been worth the sacrifice, that by vanishing he had protected not only his family, but many others who might have been silenced forever. Then came the words that struck deepest, the ones Elliot would remember for the rest of his life. Daniel said that he loved his son beyond words, that every breath in exile had been filled with the image of his boy's face, that every step away from home had been a step taken for him. He said he hoped Elliot would understand that the silence was not absence, but protection, that in his heart he had never left. He told him to be strong, to take care of his mother, and to trust the bond they shared, a bond that no letter, no false death, no enemy could sever. Elliot sobbed quietly, clutching the desk, afraid to blink, afraid to miss a single word. His dog pressed close to him, resting his head against the boy's leg, steady and grounding, as if reminding him that he was not alone. The room felt alive with the presence of his father's voice, a warmth filling the hollow spaces that grief had carved. The video continued. Daniel's face softened, his lips curving into a faint smile despite the gravity of his message. He leaned back slightly, the camera shaking as though it rested on an unsteady surface. He said that if Elliot had indeed found this message, then the time for silence was nearly over. That fate had aligned to bring them closer once again. His eyes grew brighter, the weight in them shifting into something else: hope, anticipation. He told Elliot to trust Ray, to trust his instincts, and to never doubt the love that had bound their family together. The recording neared its end, and Daniel stood. For the first time, Elliot saw more of the room. It was small, bare, without windows, only a single door in the background. His father walked toward it, turning once more to face the camera. The smile was stronger now, a spark of life breaking through the fatigue. He said one final sentence, his voice steady, his eyes glistening with unspoken promise. "Son, if you are still watching this, then it means the day has come. Look to the window." The screen went black. Elliot sat stunned, the words echoing in his ears. He turned slowly, his chest tight, his mind spinning with disbelief and longing. The room felt too small, the air too thick, the silence too heavy after such revelation. His hand remained pressed against the laptop, as though he could summon his father back with the force of touch. He wanted to shout, to call out to the image that had just vanished, but all he could do was breathe, shallow and fast. Ray shifted beside him, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the window. The boy followed his gaze. A strange stillness filled the air, as if the world itself had paused in anticipation. Elliot felt the pull of his father's words, the weight of instruction, the thread of hope that wove through every sentence. Slowly, with fear and trembling excitement, he rose to his feet, his eyes never leaving the window pane where faint morning light filtered through. And as he stood there, his heart racing, he realized that what came next would not just change his understanding of the past, it would reshape the future. The revelation was only the beginning. The blackness of the screen lingered like a shadow in the room, and for a long moment Elliot could not move. His father's words echoed within him, reverberating like the last note of a song that refused to fade. "Look to the window." The command pulsed in his mind, carrying with it a weight that pressed against his chest and left him breathless. He turned slowly, his small hands tightening against the edge of the desk as if bracing himself against the tide of possibility. The morning light outside filtered pale and gray, softened by the remnants of last night's storm. For a second he thought he saw only the empty yard, wet grass gleaming with dew, the familiar gate that had stood silent since the letter arrived. Then as his gaze sharpened, he froze. There was a figure standing at the gate. Elliot's heart leapt painfully, so hard that he felt it might break free from his ribs. The man beyond the window was tall, broad-shouldered, a bag slung over his arm. His outline was blurred by the distance and the fog of dawn, but the stance, the way he held himself, was unmistakable. Elliot pressed both palms against the glass, his breath fogging the pain, eyes wide with disbelief. The world seemed to tilt around him. He blinked, convinced he was dreaming, but when his vision cleared, the figure was still there, still watching the house, still waiting. Ray had already seen him. The dog's ears pricked, his body stiffened, and then, with a sudden, joyous bark that shattered the heavy silence, he bounded toward the door. Elliot stumbled backward, his legs shaking. He could hear the thunder of paws across the floor, the sound of claws skidding against wood. The boy's chest ached with the force of his heartbeat, a blend of terror and exhilaration. He could no longer tell whether he was afraid to be wrong or terrified of being right. He tore himself away from the window and ran after the dog, his bare feet slapping against the floorboards, his breath ragged. The house seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step heavier than the last, until at last he reached the front door. Ray scratched and barked, his tail whipping furiously. Elliot reached for the handle with trembling fingers. For one suspended second he hesitated, the weight of grief and hope colliding in his small body. He remembered the letter, the funeral words, the nights of crying into his pillow. Could it all have been a lie? Could he really open the door and find the man who had been both his hero and his ghost? He turned the handle. The door swung open, and the cool morning air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant hum of waking birds. Elliot's eyes lifted, and there he was. Daniel Clark stood framed by the rising light, the same eyes, the same smile, the same presence that had once filled their home. He looked older, his face worn by unseen battles. But he was alive, breathing, real. For a moment, father and son stared at one another, time folding in upon itself, erasing the months of silence and pain. Elliot cried out, a sound torn from the deepest part of him, and ran forward. His small arms flung around his father's waist, holding tight as if to anchor him to the earth. Daniel dropped the bag from his shoulder and knelt, enveloping his son in an embrace so fierce it trembled with both relief and sorrow. Tears streaked down Elliot's face, soaking into the fabric of his father's jacket. Ray leapt around them, barking and whining, pressing his body against Daniel, tail wagging in frenzied joy. The man laughed through his tears, reaching out to stroke the dog's fur, his voice breaking as he whispered his gratitude for the loyalty that had kept his secret safe. They remained like that for what felt like eternity, father, son, and dog reunited at last. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the warmth of arms that had been missed for too long, the pounding of hearts that once more beat in rhythm. For Elliot, it was as though a dark curtain had been torn away, revealing sunlight after endless night. The despair that had shadowed his days crumbled beneath the weight of joy. His father was home. His father was real. When at last they returned inside, the house no longer felt empty. Daniel stepped through the doorway and paused, looking around the familiar space with eyes that drank in every detail. He touched the walls lightly, as though reacquainting himself with a place he had once only visited in memory. Elliot would not release his hand, gripping it tightly, terrified it might vanish if he let go. Ray followed close behind, never straying far, his tail brushing against both father and son as if binding them together. They settled in the living room, the photograph that had hidden the secret still resting on the shelf. Daniel sat on the couch, exhaustion etched into his features, but peace softening his expression. Elliot curled beside him, his small hand still clinging to his father's, unwilling to lose even a second of the reunion. Ray lay at Daniel's feet, sighing heavily as though content at last, his watch fulfilled. Hours passed as they spoke in fragments, laughter mingling with tears. Daniel did not share every detail of his time away. Some truths were too heavy for a child, but he spoke enough for Elliot to understand the sacrifice, the danger, and the love that had bound every choice. He listened, wide-eyed, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time in months, he no longer felt abandoned. He felt chosen, trusted, loved beyond measure. As the day faded into evening, Elliot watched his father recline against the couch, his body finally surrendering to rest. Ray curled beside him, eyes half closed, his head resting on Daniel's boot. Elliot sat close, still holding on, afraid to let the moment slip into dream. He thought of the nights he had cried alone, of the despair that had weighed down his chest, and compared it to the warmth now flooding the room. The transformation felt miraculous. The photograph on the shelf caught his eye. Once it had been a symbol of loss, a wound that refused to heal. Now it stood as the keeper of a secret, the vessel that had returned his father to him. He rose quietly, crossed the room, and set the frame upright again. For the first time since the letter, he looked at it without pain. It no longer whispered of death. It spoke of life, of survival, of faith that had carried through even the darkest hours. As night descended, Elliot curled on the couch, his father's hand still clasped in his own. He felt safe in a way he had not since before the letter arrived. The grief that had haunted him had lifted, replaced by joy so strong it seemed unshakable. He glanced at Ray, whose watchful eyes had guided him to the truth, and silently thanked the dog for his loyalty, for his stubborn refusal to let the photograph remain untouched. The house that had felt so empty was full once more. The silence that had been unbearable now carried only peace. Elliot closed his eyes, a smile lingering on his lips. His father was home. His family was whole again. And though the future still carried shadows, he knew with certainty that nothing could take this moment away. Not lies, not enemies, not even time. Because in the end, a loyal dog, a falling photograph, and a hidden message had restored what grief had tried to steal. The nightmare was over. The bond between father and son, tested and strained, had endured. Elliot drifted into sleep, safe in the knowledge that the story of loss had become a story of return, and that this time, nothing could take his father from him again. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to check out our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.